What's up, world? I'm Cameron McKinney, and this is Pop Culture Spotlight, a podcast about the movie The Boy and the Heron. Here's a quick synopsis. During World War II in Japan, a young boy, Mahito, loses his mother. His father then quickly remarries to her sister and moves them, which leads to Mahito being approached by a mysterious gray heron. The film stars Luca Padovin, Robert Pattinson, Florence Pugh, Karen Fukuhara, Christian Bale, Mark Hamill, Dave Bautista, Willem Dafoe, and Gemma Chan. What I like to do when I talk about animated movies is look at the actors' history in them, and the English dub version of this film is full of movie stars. First, I want to talk about Robert Pattinson, who voices the mischievous gray heron. This is Pattinson's first animated film, and I've heard many say they are shocked at his voice work in this. It sounds nothing like the star of Twilight. If you feel that way, do yourself a favor and take a deeper look at his filmography. Pattinson has a history of doing brilliant drastic work with his voice in 3 roles specifically that blew me away. Good Time, where he plays Connie, a wannabe thief. It's a great New York accent. In The King, he plays the Dauphin, giving a wild, zany performance with a fun French accent. And Pattinson plays a Southern preacher in The Devil All the Time. The actor isn't afraid to make choices, and they usually pay off, and it definitely does in The Boy and the Heron. The Boy and the Heron also has another Batman actor in it, Christian Bale, whose history of voice work includes Pocahontas, where he voiced Thomas, one of the settlers, another Miyazaki movie, Howl's Moving Castle, where he voices the titular Hal, and in that movie, he's doing his Bruce Wayne voice, which was really interesting. Mowgli, Legend of the Jungle, where he voiced Bagheera. In The Boy and the Heron, Bale voices Sochi, who is the father of Mojito. Bale, like Pattinson, is known for his strong choices with the voices. I mean, whether his Batman voice is any good is an argument that's going to live forever. Oscar nominee Florence Pugh previously voiced Goldilocks in Puss in Boots: The Last Witch. In The Boy and the Heron, she voices the fisherwoman Kirko. I was impressed after realizing it was Pugh voicing the character. It's basically a dual performance. Mark Hamill will obviously always best be known for playing Luke Skywalker, but if you're a fan of animation, you also know him as the voice of the Joker in the Batman animated series and Firelord Ozai in Avatar: The Last Airbender. He previously voiced the villain in Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky. Muska in The Boy and the Heron, he voices Grand Uncle, a central figure in the story. And finally, Willem Dafoe has one of the most recognizable voices of our time, and he's used it in Finding Nemo as Gil and Fantastic Mr. Fox. In The Boy and the Heron, he's given one somber scene as the Noble Pelican. Let's talk about the legendary writer-director of The Boy and the Heron, Hayo Miyazaki, who has long been a staple of animation. He's a writer-director who has reached legend status, and I have to admit it, growing up, I didn't watch his movies, and I think most my age grew up with Disney and DreamWorks dominating our screens. It wasn't until later in life I discovered his movies, and I believe that's a common story in America. His films are heralded and critically acclaimed, but I wouldn't describe the movies as mainstream. I think they are movies that in America, they have a devoted fan base who loves them. After watching Miyazaki's movies, I would say he's a master world builder, and what's impressive is how many times he's built entire worlds for each movies. He's making original movies, not sequels, and yes, you can find commonality within his films, but they are all so different. One huge thing that he does that makes his movies feel different than most movies for children is how he uses, let's call them, fantastical characters that wouldn't exist in the real world. He uses them to move his stories forward emotionally and plot-wise. I'm thinking about mainly Totoro in My Neighbor Totoro, Gigi, a talking cat from Kiki's Delivery Service, and Ponyo, a princess goldfish from, of course, Ponyo, where most modern modern animated movies use characters like this to solely be cute and funny. And listen, I enjoy that sometimes, when there's a snarky sidekick who is just there to tell jokes, but when characters like that fall flat, it can affect how you feel about the movie itself. I think the most infamous example of this has come from the Star Wars movies. People were first annoyed by the Ewoks, and then again by Jar Jar Binks, where it feels like no thought was put into how these characters fit into the story. They are just there to get children interested. Whereas in a Miyazaki movie, his fantasy characters are pivotal. And there are no fairy godmother-like figures in his movies who give the main characters all the answers. Take the Heron in this movie, for example. It's a character that helps Mahito and also antagonizes him as well. When I was watching the Heron, I was thinking he was more like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland than, let's say, the genie from Aladdin. Miyazaki's movies are just filled with childlike wonder. Watching them, you feel like anything can happen in them, and one of the brilliant things about them is he makes the fantasy a known element in the worlds he's creating. For example, people know witches exist in Kiki's delivery service. There's no useless scene where she has to explain to people she's a witch. He's found a way to simplify something that could be complicated in movies like these. He's found a way to avoid useless exposition, which is something that haunts most modern movies. Miyazaki movies are also thoughtful, and I know that a lot of people think that only Pixar makes thought-provoking animated films. That's simply not the case. The Boy and the Heron deals with grief through the eyes of a child. And yes, it is fair to say many animated films have dealt with death of a parent. But for this, it isn't just the beginning of the movie. It's not a jumping off point. It's what the entire movie is about. The Boy and the Heron is a complicated movie, but if I had to dumb it down, I would say it's a movie about a boy learning more about his family. I like the fact that a lot of Miyazaki's movies, kids are the leads, and he puts them in situations that force them to grow up. Kiki becomes a witch on her own. Patsu from Castle in the Sky is fully independent. His films are about them growing up, but on their own time. When you're talking about Miyazaki movies, you have to talk about the look of them, because he's still making 2D animated films, but they are better looking than 99.99% of other animated films. I think it's really interesting to watch these movies after watching all of the Disney movies of the 90s, and I never really thought about the look of those movies. It was always about the side characters. It was always about the songs. Yes, I know some of those movies look really good. Pocahontas is a good-looking movie. Hercules is a good-looking movie. Mulan is a good-looking movie. But Miyazaki is on a whole nother level with the animation he's doing in these movies. I mean, he is concentrated on the look of them. They're not trying to be cute. They're not just about songs. They're not just about the characters. He is trying to make a world through the animation. I know a lot of people who watch movies get annoyed with films that aren't straight to the point, especially animated ones. But I like the fact that you can have a different read on Miyazaki's movies, like Spirited Away, the ultimate coming-of-age movie, Princess Mononoke about the environment, Howl's Moving Castle about humans' insecurities, The Wind Rises about the balance of love and work, and now The Boy and the Heron. And some people ask the same question that they do with Pixar. Are these movies really for children? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes. I think children can and do enjoy these movies, and then later in life, they find deeper meaning in them. And that's what good movies are supposed to do, build over time. If you watch a movie for the first time and you go, oh, this is fantastic, and then the second time you watch it, you get nothing new from that experience, is that really a great movie? My answer to that would be no. But if I watched Miyazaki's movies over and over again, I would get something new and deeper from them. Watching most of Miyazaki's movies for this podcast for the first time has been wonderful. I really had no no idea what I was missing out on, and what I noticed from the auteur is that he can make movies that feel small and grand at the same time, like My Neighbor Totoro and Kiki's Delivery Service, and also make more ambitious films like The Castle in the Sky, Spirited Away, which has horror elements in it, and Princess Mononoke, which I have to admit is my favorite of his works. It's an epic action movie that's so entertaining and has a lot to say about the relationship between man and nature. I also wanted to shout out Castle in the Sky, a movie that has my favorite of his characters he's created, Hatsu, a boy trying to redeem his father's name. Oscars. The Boy and the Heron won Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. It's the second time Miyazaki has won. The first was for Spirited Away. It won over Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and we could debate which movie is better. What's better to talk about, though, is the state of animation. It's in a great place with real artists like Lord and Miller, Guillermo del Toro, and Miyazaki, all making animated classics that are moving the art form forward and making us all take it way more seriously. It's kind of hard not to call Miyazaki the greatest animated filmmaker of all time, because there have been other great directors who have made animated movies, but they don't stay within them. Like Tim Burton has made animated movies, but then he goes and makes mostly live action movies. The same with Wes Anderson. The same with Guillermo del Toro. Miyazaki has been a consistent presence. I mean, if I had to bring up other names, I would bring up the guys who have made Disney movies. John Musker and Ron Clements. These are the guys behind Aladdin, Hercules, The Princess and the Frog, and Moana. You have to mention the name Brad Bird if you're talking about the greatest animated filmmakers of all time. I mean, he's the guy behind The Incredibles and The Iron Giant. A name I always bring up is Pixar's Pete Docter, who is the man behind Monsters, Inc., Up, Inside Out, and Soul. Lord and Miller with the Spider-Verse movies, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, and the Lego movies. I mean, that duo is incredible in the animated space. But what Miyazaki has over all of them is the longevity and the consistency to go with it. I mean, when I say there's not even close to a bad movie in his filmography, that's an understatement. I mean, most of his movies are phenomenal. And I know the figure that most people like to compare Miyazaki to is Walt Disney. Both built animated empires, Miyazaki with Studio Ghibli and Walt Disney with Disney, but they just feel like they're two figures who are going after different things. Like Walt Disney was trying to build something bigger than movies itself with theme parks. Miyazaki is only about the films themselves. And Miyazaki is different because he's also the director of these movies. I just think they're two historically different figures who have had a massive impact on animation. I don't want to harbor on Disney movies for too long, but I do want to say this. Watching The Boy and the Heron really made me feel nostalgic for the Disney movies I grew up on with the 2D animation. And I think Disney really should go back to that. Listen, I know Pixar is now having a massive success with Inside Out 2, but nobody, and I mean nobody, cared about their latest film, Wish. Nobody cared about Disney's Wish, because that movie was some CGI/hand-drawn nonsense. I think Disney should make more 2D animated films, mainly because they look good if they're done right. I mean, Wish was a terrible looking movie. I did not like the look of that film whatsoever. I mean, I watched some old Disney movies like The Black Cauldron, and I'm like, yes, this movie may be massively flawed, but it looks magnificent. Sleeping Beauty is one of the best looking animated films of all time. I know it's not up there with most people's favorite Disney animated films, but I rewatched that like once a year going, man, the look of this movie, that battle between Prince Philip and the dragon, that looks better than any animated movie I'm watching this year. That's what's so funny about animation, is you can go back and you can go, wow, this looks better than what they're making now, and that should never be the case. And that's not the case with Miyazaki. Like, I recently rewatched Bambi, and I'm like, this forest looks better than any Disney forest they've made recently. I think the big question once Miyazaki is done making movies is, what will happen to 2D animation? Will it go away forever? Will the there be somebody keeping the torch alive? I don't have the answer for that. And The Boy and the Heron is perceived to be Miyazaki's last film. He is 82 years of age, although that was also the case with The Wind Rises, a film that's as close to a biopic as he's ever made. It's about a plane engineer named Jiro. And The Boy and the Heron does have a finite feeling based on everything the filmmaker put into it, and it also has what I think is a core message in his movies, that life goes on. And that's something I admire about his movies. His endings don't have a real solution for the characters. Yes, they are somewhat happy endings, but they are also more insightful than most animated movies. Miyazaki is an all-time great filmmaker, and to say that there will never be another person like him is putting it mildly. There's a quote in The Wind Rises that artists are only creative for 10 years. Miyazaki has far surpassed that number. I personally, like many others, find his movies to be profound. And I want to give the 5 of his movies that really stand out to me, but I don't want to rank them. So here are the 5 Miyazaki movies that I think are just masterpieces. Princess Mononoke, I told you this is my favorite of his films. I will say it's number 1, but I won't rank the others. I just think this is a masterpiece. This is one of the best animated films of all time. I think it's really hard to make an animated movie feel epic, and Princess Mononoke feels epic. Castle in the Sky is just a great adventure movie. Like, you just want to spend time with the characters like Patsu. I just look at that one as like a feel-good movie. Like, you just feel good watching Castle in the Sky. The most famous of his movies is Spirited Away, and I really find that movie to be somewhat scary, especially if you are a child watching that movie. I think that is close to a horror as Miyazaki has ever made. I mean, watching your parents turn into a pig, that's terrifying. Kiki's Delivery Service, I love everything about this movie. Like, this movie, yes, it's so simple on paper. She's a witch, she's moving to a new town, but man, it's just the execution of the film. A witch who is lacking confidence in herself. I've rewatched this movie 3 times in the past year. It blows me away. It is right up there with Princess Mononoke. It is probably my 1B if Princess Mononoke is my 1A of Miyazaki movies. I personally think this is the one that kids should watch first. It's the one that has a talking cat. It's really fun. She's a witch, but you're also going to get so much out of it. In the English dub, Kirsten Dunst is the voice of Kiki. I mean, it's just the perfect fit for a movie like that, and she's so good in that voice performance. And I have to mention that the late great Phil Hartman from Saturday Night Live is the voice of Gigi the cat. And then you have what really was his first cultural hit, My Neighbor Totoro, which is kind of the movie that started it all for Miyazaki being a big name in animation. I mean, this is the one that really hits. I mean, Totoro is like an icon at this point. People have real feelings about that character. I mean, he's like Snorlax. You just watch him and you're like, this isn't a scary creature, but man, this is a giant creature. I think if you watched those 5 movies and then you watch The Boy and the Heron, you would get a lot out of it, because those movies have elements that are all in The Boy and the Heron. And it's almost like you have to do that, because The Boy and the Heron should not be your first Hayao Miyazaki movie. I mean, there's just too much in there. This is a filmmaker with a legacy, and that's the fun of watching movies from a director like this, is that I went back and I watched all of these movies in anticipation to watch The Boy and the Heron. But what's also complicated about a filmmaker like this is that his past movies are what you're judging his newer film on. And The Boy and the Heron, I really did enjoy it. I loved it even, but I don't put it up there with Princess Mononoke or Spirited Away. Like, it's just not that level for me, but I understand it winning Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. It's that good of a movie. It's just hard when a filmmaker has made so many masterpieces. And I'm also willing to admit that I may feel differently over time. I may rewatch The Boy and the Heron and put it in my top 5 Miyazaki movies. I have no idea how I'll feel about this movie in the next 5 to 10 years. That's what's great about his movies, is that you'll get something different from them after every viewing. And again, he's making movies that you want to rewatch. I want to rewatch Princess Mononoke almost every day now. It is a movie that has stayed with me since I've seen it. If The Boy and the Heron is the last film from Hayao Miyazaki, he definitely left on a high note. I didn't really really get into the specifics of the movie because there's a lot there, and I think this is a movie that you really have to experience it. I hope this podcast gets you to watch the movies of Hayao Miyazaki. Not just one of our great animated filmmakers, but one of our great filmmakers, period. And if you have children, you should definitely experience his movies with them, specifically My Neighbor Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, and Ponyo. I think these movies are great for young kids, and then you can get them into Spirited Away and those other more intense movies. And Miyazaki isn't just for children, he's for everyone. And if you have children, you should definitely let them experience his films. Thanks for listening to this edition of Pop Culture Spotlight. I'm Cameron McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Thursday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I highly recommend you check out The Boy and the Heron and all of Hayao Miyazaki's great filmography. Next week on the podcast, I'm talking about the film Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F, starring Eddie Murphy and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. So tune into that and please rate, review, and subscribe.